Hello, everybody. Welcome to Cooper Smith's End of Course Review for Human Resources Management, BUS 202. What we're going to try to do in this video is to go through the end of course review and to try to explain the concepts. I know some of the concepts may be a little bit unfamiliar to you, and we are going to try to make things as painless as possible in order to help prepare you for the final exam. And human resources management is all, of course, about human resources. Human resources being the people that work for a company, whether it be a small company with one or two people, there might be one person, the entrepreneur, who is the person who does all the human resources, to a major company which may have thousands or tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of employees around the world. Human resources means the people and the staff that operate an organization. A very simple definition, as the word is pretty much what it sounds like it ought to mean. Now, what a human resources manager does is, of course, a much more complex thing. Here are some of the issues that let's go through them. Deals with people and issues related to people. Again, here are people who are human resources managers within the company. It could be one individual who's in charge of human resources for a small company, or it could be an entire group of people who are involved in human resources for a much larger company. They deal with people, they deal with hiring, compensation, and benefits, and we'll discuss the difference between those two things in a little while. Onboarding employees, recruiting and hiring employees, managing their performance. It usually is the supervisor who actually writes reviews on employees in terms of how they're doing and does the evaluations, but the human resources office may keep track of those, may have an office that does that gathers together all the information and establishes metrics on who's performing, which parts of the organization are performing, which individuals are performing. That would really be a human resources function. And by the way, a person doesn't may have many different functions, including a human resources function. A supervisor who's a manager and who builds technology or develops products or does sales may also have a human resources function if that person also hires employees and manages employees. So, human resources, there could be people who work as human resources managers, or there could be people who work as whatever they work for, and this is one of their many functions, perhaps. Training, organizational development, and culture. Certainly, the idea of establishing, it's a big buzzword in today's day and age, a culture in the organization, a culture of hard work, culture of respect for each other. You hear many different culture of inclusiveness. So there are many different aspects of culture that may apply to a business, and that is also a human resources function. And advising senior staff about the impacts of people within an organization. In other words, the idea of keeping track, assessing people's performance, looking at grades that the person has gotten, analyzing them, storing them. Supervisors who are worried who are focusing on a day-to-day basis on developing a product or selling a product may not have time. They may write performance reviews for people, but they might not have time to go through all the reports that have been developed about a particular person over the course of many months or years. That could be a function of the human resources office. Now, one thing I want to mention before we go any further, this is kind of a survey course. We're going to discuss things regarding compensation and benefits. We're going to discuss things regarding training, and we're going to discuss things regarding employment discrimination. Each of these can be and very often are their own courses. For example, we've got an upper level course called compensation and benefits. We've got a course called training and development. There are various employment law courses that are available. So we're going to kind of cover a little bit of everything just in order to give you a holistic view of what human resources do. A human resource is a person. Human resources deal with all the people that are employed: part time, full time, adjuncts, contractors, temps. These are all human resources to various degrees. How do you get a human resource? Well, unless that person is a family member or is doing you a favor or an owner of the business, you compensate that person. Employee compensation is the amount that the employee can expect to receive from an organization. Again, that could be per job, that could be per hour, that could be per year. Compensation could be money, and compensation could be things like, a car or something like that. And they could also be established in terms of benefits, like benefits would be that a company would provide would be health insurance, 401k matching, um, life insurance, vacation, um, you know pension plans, things like that. All of these would be considered benefits. Or some of the other things like giving the person a company car, may also be considered a benefit. So, I mean, compensation and benefits, there's no real strict delineation between the two. They're really just different forms of the same thing. They're really just different forms of the inducement that you give to somebody to work for you. But compensation and benefits is, of course, certainly within the province of a human resources manager because you have to figure out what kind of benefits and compensation do you want to give. The more you give, the happier the employees are going to be, the more likely you are to get good employees. On the other hand, the more you give, the less money the company has to keep for itself, and the more business the company has to do in order to maintain its staff and its workflow. And then let's step back a little bit and let's move into the area of recruiting employees. Recruiting employees means finding the best qualified candidate from the outside. And this is, of course, also a kind of a balancing test because you can recruit spending a lot of money and a lot of resources by putting in ads in newspapers, putting in big ads in newspapers, devoting a lot of time to writing really, really good job descriptions. Or you can just kind of put up an ad on the internet in a very cheap or free site. The people that you have working for you that are doing the recruiting or doing the human resources may put a lot of effort into finding an employee or may not put that much effort. And there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer in terms of how much effort should be put into recruiting an employee. A lot depends on what you're recruiting the employee for. If it's a day job and you only want the person to work for you for 8 hours, well, you're not going to put in a tremendous amount of effort to recruit the best possible person. You're really just going to take the person and figure it's not that big a deal. On the other hand, if you're recruiting somebody to pay a six-figure salary to for the next 10 years, hopefully, obviously you're going to want to put in a lot more effort. So the process of recruiting employees is from within the organization or outside an organization. If you're putting an ad, obviously you're looking for somebody outside the organization, or you could try to find somebody who already works in the company to move, either to move up or to move laterally to a different position. Very often, companies recruit from within before they start recruiting from without. Recruiting from within is a lot easier because you've got a captive audience. You put something on the company listserv, everybody can read it, it's free, and people will pay attention to it, saying, we've got a new position on in management. Apply by speaking to your boss. That could be a lot easier. On the other hand, you're not going to reach as wide a pool of people as you will if you look to the outside. So the recruitment process, analyzing the requirements for a job, and then of course attracting employees to that job. You're going to need to set a compensation level and a benefits level that's going to recruit people, that's going to entice people to come. Screening and selecting applicants, which means you ask for resumes. And I've put up a lot of job ads in my time. Very often you'll get 100 resumes, 200 resumes, or whatever it is. You got to whittle them down somehow, and you got to think about what you want. Do you want the people who are most qualified? Do you want people who are most likely to take the job? If you're offering a $30,000-$40,000 a year position and you get an applicant who has a PhD, you might think that person may be super duper qualified, but on the other hand, is that person really going to be happy doing this job? That's something you got to think about. So you got to select the applicants that you think are not only most qualified, but also most likely to do a good job. Hire the person, and of course, then integrating the employee into the organization, doing the training, figuring out where that person is actually going to fit in within your organization. These are all things that are critical when it comes to the process of recruitment, the process of moving somebody into your organization. The hiring process, which is that fourth stage, is the process of finding, evaluating, and establishing a relationship with future employees, interns. An intern is somebody who doesn't necessarily work with you full time, a person who may be in college, a person may be in school and work with you part time or over the course of a summer. A contractor is somebody who's not an actual employee, but a person who you're hiring to do a particular project. You hire somebody to fix your roof, that person is a contractor. You hire somebody to do construction in your house, you're not hiring that person full time. You're not going to give them, payroll, but you're hiring them and giving them a particular amount of money for a particular job that they're doing. And just one one difference, just from a tax perspective, for example, is that a contractor gets what's called a 1099, where you report specifically to the contractor and to the IRS what that person has gotten for the job. The contractor will typically report it on his or her own business return, or Schedule C of a regular return, which is the business organizations, which is the business income section. And then you have consultants. Consultants are kind of a subcategory of contractors, but people who you're bringing in not necessarily to work with you full time, but maybe to work with you for a few weeks, maybe to work with you for a certain number of hours, to review whatever it is you want them to review and give suggestions, give advice, try to help run things in a more efficient way. And the hiring process can take a long time, from reviewing applications, selecting the right candidates to interview. You do not have an infinite amount of time to interview everybody. You might put in an ad on Indeed.com or something, or Jobs.com or Monster.com, that you have a position open, and you might get 125 resumes. Again, don't think it's unrealistic. If it's a decent job and you're offering a decent salary with a decent company, you might get 10 times that, and you could get a lot of resumes. So you got to take the time to review the resumes. It has to be somebody from the company. Some companies do it electronically, where they literally have some software screen resumes to make sure they have certain words. In other words, if they don't have certain buzzwords in that resume, like Microsoft Word, or R, for statistics, or data analysis, or whatever it is, they don't even bother with them. They go straight to the wastebasket. But even when you do have resumes that they've reached a certain level, you have to choose which of these people are worth interviewing. You might have 100 resumes, 20 of them look good, but we only have the time to interview 5 of them. You might start even with a screening interview, an interview that's you might do 20 interviews of 5-minute phone calls each, so that you can actually do 3 real interviews. So how many stages in the process? That's really up to you. There might be just one stage where you just call in the person you want to interview and offer the job. There might be several stages where you whittle down the resumes, and do 5-minute phone interviews, and then, with 20 people, and then bring in 7 people for 1 hour interviews, and then bring in 3 people for full interviews with the whole office, and then decide on one person. Again, it really depends. If it's a relatively small job, you're probably not going to have time to do all that. If you're hiring a CEO, or you're hiring somebody who's going to get paid a lot of money and work in an extremely important position, it might be worth doing all of that. You might want to also test candidates. Testing candidates is something that a lot of these websites are doing these days. Again, like Indeed.com, you can actually have people take a test, a multiple choice test that they put together or you put together, just to make sure that they have certain characteristics that you want. The test could be questions about their personality or about what they would do, or they could be questions about a field, technical questions that's literally a test. And you might choose to only interview people who do, who give certain answers, or do on a certain level with tests. And there are lots of these out there. And again, it's just part of the process of trying to whittle down the field. You get 100 applicants, maybe only 10 of them do well in the tests, so maybe that whittles the field down to 10. Choosing between candidates to make the hiring decision, and performing various pre-employment tests and checks. Then at some point, you're going to have to decide, number one, who is going to best for the job, but also, if there are multiple people who can do the job, who fits in best with the culture of the company. That's very important also. So these are all things that you're going to want to figure out. And then once you do settle on a candidate, you have to negotiate a salary, benefits. You have to explain what the offer is. The person might negotiate. You say, we'll offer you $50,000 a year, and the person says, no, I need 60. And you can negotiate back and forth and decide whether you want the candidate or to move on to a different candidate. That's really up to you and up to your company. And there are pre-employment tests and checks. In other words, you might run a background check on someone. You might try to find out if the person has a criminal record, and you might try to. There are virtually unlimited number of things that people can check for. Some companies run credit checks on people. Maybe they don't want employees with huge amounts of debts, or who have histories of not paying their debts. People who have histories of not paying their debts maybe are more likely to be desperate and more likely to steal from the company. Again, these are things that individual companies have to take into account. There are certain things that you're not allowed to check, that we'll discuss in a little bit when we're talking about employment discrimination. But generally speaking, it's pretty much up to the employer to decide what factors are, are important to an employee performance. Personnel is the overall term for the people that are working for a company. So when you hear that term, that's the organization's most significant asset because these are the people working for the organization. I guess there are some organizations that some sort of physical plant or physical item might be the most important thing for an organization, but for most organizations, most of the expense and most of the work is done by the people working for the company, and therefore your human resources. You hear it said a lot. Human resources is the most important asset of a company. Now, which organizations have to deal with human resources, or what does have to deal with sorry, for so an organization is really anything that is a group of people. It could be a business, it could be a charity, it could be some sort of an other nonprofit organization, it could be a consortium of representatives from different companies. So every organization really has to deal with human resources, even if they're all volunteers. I mean, if you have a homeless shelter and you need volunteers to give to package the meals or whatever it is, that's still human resources. May not be paying anything, but you still have to manage your volunteers. You can't let them just do whatever they want. If you do that, then your company isn't going to run very efficiently, or your organization isn't going to run very efficiently. Then we have the issue of morality. Morality is a general idea of the difference between right and wrong, or good and bad. Now, morality is, of course, something that every company has to watch for. Number one, because things that are immoral decrease their reputation. They also may be illegal. They also may drive customers away, drive potential employees away. And therefore, part of the human resources uh, process is ensuring that certain standards of morality are established. Promoting morality in organization in orientation programs, especially big companies that have onboarding sessions where they train people, explaining to them how important it is to follow the company's ethical rules is a key part of any training. Providing employees with standards, policies, and procedures. Again, big companies very often have big, thick policy manuals. Hopefully, they're not too big and thick, though otherwise people won't read them. But you want them to explain what level of ethics and what reactions certain people think are important. And of course, to encourage managerial support in displaying moral behavior. The idea is the supervisor sets the tone. What they call it in compliance programs is tone at the top, or tone from the top. If the supervisor isn't behaving properly, then the subordinates probably are going to take their cue from that person as well. And the next thing I want to focus on is the issue of competitive advantage. Now, competitive advantage is something that we usually talk about when we're talking about a product. My product tastes better. My product drives faster. My product is more comfortable. And that certainly is true. That is part of what a competitive advantage is. That's what we're talking about when we talk about a product. A competitive advantage might be that a company has and that it's able to make a better or cheaper product. Delta Airlines may have a competitive advantage in terms of airplane maintenance because it has so much experience in having a lot of really good airline maintenance people. A restaurant might have a competitive advantage in that it has a really good reputation. So that's true when selling a product, but a competitive advantage also applies when you're talking about human resources. You may have a competitive advantage that your employees don't have the same kind of onerous contract that were negotiated by another company's employees. Or maybe you're able to offer better benefits, or you've got a better reputation, and you're able to attract people who are going to do a better job for less money. So the competitive advantage could take many, many, many different forms, but it's also very important to consider that when you're talking about human resources, because gaining a competitive advantage either through the people that you have or through some sort of cost savings or through some sort of mechanism that you have can be something very important when you're talking about an industry in general. And human resources manager also, of course, has to deal with conflict. Avoiding conflict totally is probably impossible unless you develop the sort of culture that makes people not throw their ideas around, which is something that you don't want. You want to encourage your employees to put in their ideas. So given that you do want to encourage employees to contribute ideas and to have discussions, managing conflict is a very important role of a human resources manager or a manager in general, based on the idea that people are going to have disagreements, and how you give weight to everybody's opinion and still do come up with an ultimate decision is of course something that's going to be very important. So that's part of the issue of understanding and appreciating and dealing with the disagreements that come from people's needs, people's beliefs, people's resources, people's relationships, etc. Managing conflicts, of course, is part of leadership. Leadership means the motivating a group of people to act towards a common goal. That could be leading by example. Somebody that works really hard and doesn't take time off when they don't need it, may inspire other people to do the same. If you have a boss who talks constantly about working hard, working hard, working hard, and then doesn't show up until 10 o'clock every day and is out the door at 5, well, then the employees are probably going to take the same cue. Leadership also means discussing things with people, understanding where they're coming from, talking in a way that both motivates people but also doesn't knock them down. So leadership is obviously one of the key skills when you're talking about human resources management. And leadership is also an element of support. Support means putting the employee in the position that he or she can contribute most to the company. There might be people who work for a company that do nothing but support. There may be people like, for example, secretaries are primarily considered support staff. If you have a law firm and a lawyer has a secretary, well, the secretary may do things like pick up the phone and type over information that's dictated, communicate with people or try to screen phone calls, handle emails, file things, maybe even do things like make coffee or whatever it is. I mean, all these things are support functions, and they, even though those support functions may not necessarily go directly towards developing or producing or selling the product, they enable the people who do those things to do it in a more effective and more efficient and better way. So support is also key. The fact that somebody's a support person in a company is not an insult at all. It could be a very, very important element of the company. An HR practitioner is somebody who works in a human resources department in a company. A department could have many people, a department could have one person, or a department could be a fraction of a person. When I say a fraction of a person, it could be somebody has, in a small company with 4 or 5 employees, there might be one person who is in charge of human resources, and that might be 1/3 of her job, or 1/5 of her job, or 1/2 of her job, or whatever the case may be. The point is, a human resources practitioner is somebody who is responsible to know and understand these various aspects of human resources, including some of the things that we're going to discuss a little bit later on in this course as well. In HR, there is, for example, an entire organization called SHRM, the Society for Human Resources Management. And what they do is they set up certificates and voluntary tests that you can take, and to get designations as as a human resources manager. They also put out books and continuing education seminars, and training sessions and training videos, all about human resources. Human resources is its very own industry in that respect, and a practitioner is somebody who practices human resources management. That could be somebody who's trained to do it with a college degree in human resources management, or it could simply be somebody who has no choice. The person's an entrepreneur or managing something and has to be able to do this and kind of learns it on the fly. Either one can be an HR practitioner, although obviously you want as much training and expertise as possible. So a successful HR practitioner should have up-to-date legal knowledge as it relates to the field of human resources management. That's what we're going to segue into now. We're going to look at some of the most important legal restrictions and legal rules that regard things like hiring, human resources, firing, etc. So now let's go into some of the legal aspects of HRM. And these are huge, of course. You can take entire courses, entire degrees on human resources management legal rules. But there are some that are very important that we're going to cover in this survey course. First is the Family Medical Leave Act. The Family Medical Leave Act addresses the idea of people that need to leave work for various reasons relevant to family. Now, in many countries, in Europe especially, you're entitled to paid leave for things like having a child and maternity, paternity, things like that. The United States doesn't have that, except some states do, but you don't have that on the federal level. In other words, you don't have that on the nationwide level. But what you do have in the Family Medical Leave Act is that everybody is entitled to take up to 12 weeks, and this is whether you're talking about a man or a woman, when paternity or maternity, for things like childbirth, adoption, also illness. Helping somebody, helping nursing a relative back to health applies also. So you can take it's up to 12 weeks unpaid. In other words, you can say the company can give paid leave for maternity or paternity or for illness or whatever it is. They don't have to. Usually, you have a certain number of sick days, but let's say beyond that, you want to take up to 3 months off. So the Family Medical Leave Act says you cannot be fired for that. Your job has to be available when you get back. Again, it doesn't mean you have to get paid for it. That's really up to the company, and some states have certain requirements that you do give certain paid time off. But that is the Family Medical Leave Act that essentially you have in every state, no matter where you are, you have up to 12 weeks to be able to take unpaid leave if you need it. So, and of course, it only applies to, there are certain restrictions. Very, very small companies may not be required. It applies only to individuals who have worked for an organization for more than a year. It also applies only to companies of a certain size. There are also some limitations. In fact, very often rules only apply to these limitations. Things like this, like the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, which was part of the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s. In 1964 was the Civil Rights Act, and one of the things the Civil Rights Act did was it said that in employment for companies, I believe, of 15 employees or more, are not allowed to discriminate on the basis of race, of gender, of religion, and of various other criteria. Somebody cannot be fired, for example, because that person is black or because that person is Christian or whatever, for whatever the reason is. That would be unconstitutional. I mean, not. I'm sorry, that would be illegal under federal law. There are certain exceptions. For example, a church is allowed to say, we're only going to hire a Catholic to be our priest, for obvious reasons. That's something called a BFOQ, a bona fide occupational qualification, where if somebody has to be a particular type of it has to be part of this group in order for in order for this person to for the job to make sense for that person, then that's okay. But other than that, to discriminate is illegal. I mean, just to give you an idea, obviously, if you need a model to model men's clothing, then the person, you're allowed to say only men, because obviously it has to be that way. But to say that for somebody to pick up the phone and say, well, only women can do it because we like their voices better, that might be illegal. So similarly, you have the Age Discrimination in Employment Act. And what that says is that if you're 40 or more, 40 or over, you get the protection of you can't be discriminated against based on your age. The idea is, and this is something that is, all too real, that people who are older do get discriminated against, and people don't want to hire people who are older because they think they're not going to be as energetic and they're not going to be able to learn the new technologies as well, and they're going to want more money, and they're going to retire earlier, and they're more susceptible to health problems. But Congress stepped in 1967 and said that cannot be a basis, that cannot be a legal basis to um, hire or fire somebody. It makes age discrimination illegal for applicants over age 40. It covers employment activities, hiring, firing, layoffs, promotions, compensation. That doesn't mean you can never fire anybody over 40 or never lay off anybody over 40, but you cannot lay somebody off because they're over 40. And whether a person was actually laid off because they were older can be based on what people said, and it could be based on implications. If a company laid off 12 people and every single one of them were old and every single one of the young people were kept on, then a company might have a little splaining to do, and might be forced to explain why and justify why these people were let go and not the other people. Um, Age-based harassment is also illegal. An employment policy can also be illegal if it applies to all employees, but just has a negative impact on applicants. I mean, let me just to give you a crazy example. What if you have a law firm and you say, well, in order for you to continue to work here, you have to be able to bench press 100 and 200 pounds or 150 pounds or whatever it is. Now, you say, well, that has nothing to do with age. That has nothing to do with gender. That's totally, totally neutral. It isn't. It doesn't matter what your gender. It doesn't matter what your age. If you can bench 150 pounds, then you can work for us. Otherwise, you can't. Well, obviously that has nothing to do with the job itself. So if you're doing it, there must be some ulterior motive you have over here. So it can be reasonably inferred by a jury or by a judge that what you're really doing here is you're trying to keep only the young people, keep only the strong people in your firm, and that could be illegal. It doesn't protect older workers from being terminated based on job performance. Obviously, if you don't do a good job, you can be fired no matter what your age. It protects Sorry, the slide was a little confusing there. I just had to make a little bit of a change. It doesn't apply to very small companies. It doesn't. I believe it's either. I thought it was 15. Maybe it's 25. The number of employees you have to have in order to be subject to the Civil Rights Act, including the Age Discrimination and Employment Act. And there are other non-discrimination acts in the federal level, but there are also non-discrimination acts on the state level. For example, some states may pass a rule saying you're not allowed to discriminate against people based on criminal history. Whereas in the federal level, you're allowed to say, I don't want to hire you if you're a convicted felon. There are some states that actually say that you can't discriminate against people based on criminal history. So regardless, whatever your state is, you have to understand what the employment discrimination rules are of your state, and you can't just rely on the federal rules. Federal rules apply across the country. States are free to add additional requirements on employees in terms of anti-discrimination. Types of employees include people who are permanent, people who are there long term, and people who are temporary. Temporary employment, odd jobs, things like that, is an employment situation where working is limited to a certain period of time based on the needs of the employing organization. That could be a person working as an intern, a person working there for the summer or whatever it is, or there are temp agencies. There are whole agencies that may have staffs of accountants who are either unemployed or have extra time, and they might have 100 names on the list, and an accounting firm calls them up and says, we've got a really, really big merger that we have to do. We need 10 temps. And so they'll say, okay, here are 10 good temps that you can use. Temporary employees obviously are also part of human resources management. Again, these are people who it's expected that their work will run out after a given period of time rather than being there until being fired. They can also be promoted within an organization to full-time employment status, of course, if the person is doing well for the company and if the company thinks it's a good idea. An innovative firm, general rule regarding an idea. Innovative means a firm that is constantly looking to make things better, and innovating means to constantly be improving workflow and improving how a company does. One of the things that innovative firms will try to do is to establish a heterogeneous workforce. Heterogeneous means different types of people that look at it from. I'm not talking about necessarily different ages and different races and different. I mean that may all be part of it, but also people who think differently. You don't want to have an echo chamber, so to speak, where everybody thinks the same way and everybody just repeats the same ideas. You want people to look at things differently and to have experience with different markets. And so the idea is that innovative firms try to bring people together from different areas and have different takes and different ways of viewing things, etc. One of the things you want to try to keep down when you're talking about human resources management is the turnover rate. Turnover rate is the percentage of employees who leave during a certain period of time. For example, a 10% year-over-year turnover rate means that 10% of your employees left over the last year or were fired and replaced. Some turnover is necessary. You're not going to keep people forever. People are going to retire eventually, or some people aren't going to, no matter how good you are in hiring, some people that you hire aren't going to be good, or some people are going to get other jobs, and that's fine and good. But generally, you want to keep turnover rate low because of the fact that the more turnover you have, the more you have to train new people. Somebody who's been working for your firm for 5 years, that person's got all the experience, that person's got all the training, that person knows your business. That person leaves and somebody else comes in, then you got to train that person from scratch. You might waste 3 or 4 months getting that person up to speed. So the idea of turnover rate being, there is some turnover that's always going to be necessary, but you want to try to keep it as low as possible. Some turnover can include voluntary resignations, dismissals, in other words, firings, non-certifications, and people had there are certain jobs that they need, certain licenses that they need in order to continue with a particular job that they don't have, retirements, etc. Turnover rates in disabled population, generally speaking, being lower than non-disabled population. The reason why this is important is because there are rules regarding treating disabled people. There's the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the Americans with Disabilities Act says that you have to make reasonable accommodations for disabled people. If you have a job and somebody's in a wheelchair and can't get up the steps, you need to, if it's again assuming it's reasonable under the circumstances, to be able to establish a ramp or an elevator. New buildings, for example, of public buildings, whether they be places of worship or offices or whatever it is, virtually all have elevators for this reason, because you're required to make certain accommodations. And it could be a major disability like being in a wheelchair, or it could be a minor disability like, glaucoma, I believe, is considered a disability for certain circumstances. If there are reasonable accommodations that can be made, then the law requires you to do that. And you can imagine that there's relatively low turnover because people who are, especially if they're treated properly, are people who have disabilities. Once they find a situation that they're comfortable in, are less likely to move on. So that's actually one advantage of hiring people who are disabled, and the idea that you're probably a little bit less likely for them to want to move on to other situations, especially if they're treated well and they're comfortable in their positions. Okay, now I just want to focus on a few of the rules, laws regarding human resources and human resources management. Obviously, there are many, many regulations that apply to employment law. There's an entire organization called the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and they're in charge of partially in charge of enforcing the Civil Rights Acts. People can bring private lawsuits if they feel those rules have been violated. There are many, many different regulations that we're going to discuss and that we have discussed. Uh, Illegal immigration is another issue. Now, immigration is typically a federal issue. In other words, states don't really get to decide what they think of you hiring illegal immigrants or people who have green cards, people who are not citizens, people who are residents, whatever it is. That sort of policy is really up to the federal government. States can, of course, regulate working environments to some extent, but when it comes to things like the process of making sure that people have appropriate immigration status, that's really a federal policy. There's like e-verify, for example, which is a federal policy that employers can verify the immigration status of potential employers, of potential employees. Then, as we discussed before, similarly, you have the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that requires reasonable accommodations. And you've got the Family Medical Leave Act. And because of these rules, employers are required to make reasonable accommodations for people, such as, for example, expecting mothers who may uh, be physically limited. If there are accommodations that are reasonable under the circumstances, they may actually be expected to make these accommodations. A worker requirement is also something that comes in when you're talking about these legal restrictions. That, of course, is a requirement that you have for your worker to have, a quality or qualification that you must have in order to be suitable for a job. For example, you have to have a law license to be a lawyer in a law firm. You have to have a medical license to be a doctor in practice. Obviously, these things are perfectly legitimate. An example of a legitimate worker requirement would be something like this, where somebody is asked, can during the holiday season, can you work extra hours? And the person says, well, no, because I have to be home at 6 o'clock every day. Well, then it would be reasonable for the employer to say, well, then I'm sorry, we can't have you during the holiday season. Just like it's reasonable for an employer to say, listen, you can't work in our medical practice unless you're a doctor, or you can't work for our law firm unless you're a lawyer. It's also reasonable for people to have these sorts of requirements. Where it becomes problematic is where these things are used as excuses for discrimination, or only enforced against people of one group and not enforced against people of another group. That obviously is where you really, really run into trouble in this sort of thing. Okay, let us switch gears a little bit, and I want to move on to things that have to do with the employee process. In other words, uh, the human resources management process, really. And first is the exit interview. Now, obviously, exit is not really the first thing over here, but we'll cover that first because that's first in the slides. An exit interview is an important diagnostic tool that companies can use to make a determination if there's something that they can do to improve their firm or improve their office. An exit interview is held with an employee about to leave an organization, usually when the person has resigned, when the person is fired. The person can also have an exit interview, but then the conditions might not be as pleasant. But if somebody's resigning or somebody's leaving for another job, a well-structured and well-functioning human resources office will sit down with the person and say, okay, what are some of the issues you had? What are some of the things that we can improve? Not because you're necessarily going to take everything that they say and do it, but because this way you get a little bit of feedback in terms of what you can do for the rest of your organization and for the people that are still there. It's voluntary. You can't force somebody to conduct an exit interview, and it's conducted by the human resources representative of the company. Another possibility, or another aspect of human resources management. This is kind of more of on a day-to-day basis than you're talking about when you're talking about an exit interview, but is the performance appraisal process. This is the process by which people are judged and evaluated by supervisors, and these decisions can be turned into these can be used to determine whether a person gets a raise and whether a person eventually gets let go if the appraisal process reveals that this person is not working up to the standard required by the company. An appraisal could be routine. An appraisal could be, every 6 months you get a performance review, or it could be situation based. Which means there's something particularly going on. Somebody made a complaint. A project just finished. We have to determine whether somebody gets promoted. We have to determine who works on a particular new project. So in order to make those determinations, somebody might be appraised at a given moment. You might have the employer, the supervisor come in and say, how did this employee does it? How does this employee work with teams? How does this employee work in terms of timing? How does this employee work on projects? And so it could be there a well-functioning company has periodic, maybe every year, maybe twice a year, reviews where the supervisor evaluates the employees working under him or her periodically, but also it could be based on a particular situation. And the person who does this, in other words, usually the boss, should should prepare the review. It could be written, it could be oral, and present it to the employee. The employee and the other people in there might be a personnel file for the person, and the employee should be told, again, either orally or in writing, what the review was, how that person has been rated, and what the problems are, and certainly probably the most important thing is how the person can improve. Our next section is about teams and feedback. Teams are something that every small and mid-sized company actually has to get used to and has to do well. If people can work together a lot better than they can work separately. People contribute ideas, people contribute strengths. One person's strength may be organization, another person's strength may be salesmanship. If they can work together, that's great. And as a supervisor, it really is incumbent upon the supervisor to provide feedback in both senses. Some feedback to the individuals in terms of how they did, and feedback to the team in terms of how they worked as a team. And speaking of feedback, the kind of ideal overall way that you can give feedback to a person or to a team is the quote unquote 360 feedback model. That includes feedback from essentially everybody: subordinates, colleagues, supervisors, even people evaluating themselves. Now, again, these things aren't all necessarily going to determine whether the person gets the raise or whether the person gets fired. You can't rely on, for example, people to evaluate themselves to determine whether they're going to get a raise. And certainly subordinates may be a little hesitant to evaluate their supervisors in a fully honest way, but seeking feedback to the extent that that it can be sought is something that can definitely help. Asking a subordinate, what do you think we could have done differently on the last project? What do you think might have helped in that sales meeting or whatever it is? It doesn't have to be, evaluate me as a boss. Tell me whether you think I did a good job, because well, then of course the subordinate may not may not really be able to be 100% honest, but or 100% forthcoming, I shouldn't say honest, really 100% transparent. But still, the idea of trying to get its feedback from as many sources as possible is a very important element of management in general. Uh, you know, just an example, people are very often asked to rate themselves. I mean, sometimes when I was in school, we were asked to grade our own tests. but by the way, people don't even necessarily have to tell other people how they rate themselves. But if you sit down every once in a while and figure, what could I have done differently over the last 4 months, that may actually help to improve behavior. And that's a feedback, a self-assessment is certainly an important component of feedback. What about where we move to the idea of problematic performances? Problematic performances, it's a little bit of an overly broad term, because problematic doesn't mean there's any specific failing that you can necessarily point to, problematic performance means anytime there is something that you wanted to do and it wasn't accomplished. It could be you wanted to sell 100 cars this month and you only sold 60 cars this month. You wanted this customer to hire you, the customer didn't hire you. So the idea of problematic performance is not that there necessarily has to be blame or that it's somebody's fault. It's the idea of, what can we look at in terms of how some performance went, and make a determination of what can be done differently next time or what can be done better next time. That's the idea of problematic performance. If there's any kind of a shortfall in performance, an assessment strategy should be employed to make sure that hopefully next time things can be improved so that the problematic performance doesn't repeat itself. And that's why, if something doesn't happen properly, you fail to close an account, you fail to make a sale, you have a bad month, or whatever it is, it should be addressed as quickly as possible after the event, when memories are still fresh and it hasn't been rationalized, and maybe even when the disappointment is still fresh, and that motivates people to engage in this sort of feedback mechanism to allow the overall improvement later on. And that's why the next stage is really to correct the problematic performance, to adjust the problematic performance, to improve the problematic performance. What are some examples? Things like coaching or mentoring. In other words, people who are supervisors, people who have experience working with the people who maybe, again, not necessarily that it's their fault, but people that just weren't able to achieve the optimal performance, to explain to them what could have been done differently, additional training, additional professional development, continuing education programs, whatever it is, and of course, setting goals. It's very easy to not perform when you have no end game. If your goal is to sell 100 cars in a month, well, you're going to be working hard toward that goal. Obviously, goals have to be realistic. You can't say I'm going to sell 1,000,000 cars in a month, but if the goal is realistic, then setting decent goals, and it improves people's self-confidence and morale when they meet those goals, and it hopefully causes some assessment mechanisms to be put into place when those goals are not met. Next, I want to cover some benefits and things that are kind of like benefits that are important to know for human resources management. First of all, workers' compensation. Now, the first thing to know about workers' compensation is this is a scheme that's developed by each state individually, so it's not the sort of thing that's going to be uniform throughout the country. And it could also be very complicated when it comes to the ins and outs and the nitty-gritty. The workers' compensation system is based on a problem of liability of the employer when an employee gets hurt. In the old days, when people were working in factories, like in the famous Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, where a bunch of people got killed in a fire, or when people got hurt in machines and working, whatever it is, it was very difficult for the employee to recover anything. They had to sue the employer, which was very difficult. The employer had a lot of had the resources. They also had to show negligence on the employer, which was sometimes hard to do. So therefore, states started to make these plans that said as follows: if you get hurt on the job, something to do with the job. I don't mean like you slipped and fell when you were going to get a cup of coffee. That might that might or might not be different. But if you got killed in or hurt in a way that has something to do with the job, you are entitled to compensation from the employer, excuse me, and the employer will purchase insurance. Now, some workers' compensation insurance may be required by state law, but that way the employer is protected and the employee is protected. The employer pays the insurance premiums, and if the employee gets hurt, then the employee has a mechanism by which to collect the reasonable value of services. Now, workers' compensation again could be extremely complicated because it depends on what the injury is, and there are certain. I mean, it literally goes down to various body parts get different values. The rules are extremely complicated, but the overall idea is simple, and that is the employer sets up the workers' compensation insurance. If the employee gets hurt, then the employee gets paid out of that for whatever the value of the damage is. That's important because if you are a human resources manager, you're going to have to understand the workers' compensation plan in your state, and you're going to have to purchase workers' compensation insurance, and there may be state laws in terms of what you have to purchase, and it's the sort of thing you definitely got to read up on if you're going to work in human resources. A cafeteria benefit plan program is part of, when the employers very often provide various types of benefit plans for employees, things like health insurance and life insurance and various other types of insurance, and it could include a vision or dental or anything like that. And a cafeteria plan is essentially where there are various options that employees have, and the employee then gets to choose, I want this, I want that. Obviously, the more they take, the more they're going to have to pay in terms of premiums. For example, you're talking about a health insurance policy. Well, you could have one health insurance policy, and everybody in the company could take it or leave it. And some employers will pay for the whole premium. Some employers only pay for half of the premiums. There are certain regulations that require that they pay for a certain amount under the Affordable Care Act. There are certain, people that are working for more than 30 hours a week have to be offered health insurance for companies of a certain size. So you could have kind of a take it or leave it plan, or there could be various plans where employees can choose how much they want to purchase from the plans that are established by the employers. Um, there also are different type of pay structures. There are pay structures that are compensation, incentive, indirect payment. For example, you go to work for somebody, you get $50,000 a year. That's regular compensation. On the other hand, what if you're a seller? You sell copy machines, you sell computers, you sell cars, whatever it is. Employer says, okay, listen, you're going to make a base salary of $10,000 a year or very little, but then you make a commission for every car you sell. You get an extra $400, or you get an extra 5% of whatever the value of the car is, or whatever the case may be, or half of whatever we make on the that's above the invoice price, whatever the structure is. So that's really a commission, which is a type of incentive based programs. So you get paid the same amount no matter what. You could get paid nothing and just based on commission, in which case you're very often not an employee, you may be a contractor, or there could be kind of a hybrid where you get a base and then you get commission over and above that. So those are pay structures that organizations use as a way to encourage competition. You tell everybody in the car dealership, well, all the salespeople, you don't get much as a base, but you get more money the more cars you sell. So if people sell more cars, they obviously have an incentive to do that. And that finally brings us to something that's not really an employer-based program, but it's something that you should understand what it is, and that is Medicare. Employers typically cover health insurance for employees. Not always, but again, many employers, and especially in medium and big companies, are required to do it for full-time employees. So there's really three types of health insurance. There's private health insurance, which is usually paid for by employers or employees or both. There's Medicaid, which is paid for by the government for people who are too poor to afford their own, and there's Medicare mostly for people over 65 and a few other people, but for the most part, people over 65, and they are entitled to health insurance whether they're working or not. People who are over 65 and working may have Medicare and then may have a supplemental insurance paid for by the employer, or may have supplemental insurance paid for by themselves. But the point is, as a human resources manager for employees over 65, you have to understand the difference between what you're offering and what Medicare is offering, just based on how to, if nothing else, to advise the employees in terms of what plan is going to be better for them. Now, an employee can be paid by contract, can have a certain number of years that they're required to work for the company, and the company is willing to pay for them. Like a baseball player is usually gets 5 years, $10 million. So that's a contract employee. Or there is what is called an at-will employee. An at-will employee is something that the employee or employer can terminate without any warning or reason or for any purpose. I mean, there's another type of employee who has to be fired only for just cause, like for many state employees. There are also some states in general that say that you have to have some sort of a cause in order to fire an employee. Most states are what are called at-will states, which means the general rule is, unless stated otherwise, an employee or employer could end the relationship at any time and for any reason whatsoever, except for an illegal reason. For example, he's firing somebody because she's a woman, or because he's a Muslim, or because he's Hispanic, or whatever it is. Those things are illegal even with at-will employees. You cannot fire somebody on a discriminatory basis. But for pretty much any other reason, even if there's no reason, you could theoretically, for an at-will employee, you can fire someone because you don't like the way they look, or because they don't play, they shot a poor golf game. It really doesn't matter. It's totally up to, just like any other relationship. You want to leave it, you don't have to give a reason. Same thing is true with an employment relationship. An example: if you want to fire somebody because they've shown up to work late, or because they're under the influence of drugs, the truth is that kind of person can probably be fired for cause. There are differences, by the way. There are some very important differences in that people who are fired for cause may not be entitled to unemployment benefits, whereas people who are laid off or just dismissed for no reason in particular would be entitled to unemployment benefits. So again, that's something a little bit beyond the scope of what we're discussing in this course. So there are some differences between for cause firings and just layoffs, which basically means I'm eliminating the position. So unfortunately, you have no more job. But again, so it's important to keep that distinction in mind, and we'll cover that in other courses. Organizational discipline, again, is the idea of making sure that your business and your company is able to act in a way that is smart, the practice of self-restraint and learning to follow the best course of action. In team activities, that means working towards the same goal and not necessarily your individual goal. An example might be a newscast, where each newscaster, each reporter wants to get the big story and wants to report the big story and get fame and FaceTime, and for people to think, wow, this is a really great reporter. But it may make more sense for them to sit down and think about, maybe I should present this story and you should present that story. Showing discipline in a way where everybody is working towards the end goal of the company is an important step in the maturity of an organization. Discipline decline when people start scrambling for themselves and not focusing as a team and not working for the best interest of the organization. How do you prevent that sort of thing? Well, proper selection of candidates. Obviously, you don't want to select a bunch of people who are selfish and they're out there just to make money and not for the best interest of the company. Performance appraisals. Make sure people who are showing selfish behaviors and are showing incompetent behaviors are told what the issues are and how they have to improve. And of course, training and development, increasing the exposure of the people to these helpful ideas. That brings us to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That is a psychological concept. In our psychology courses, probably deal with this in various ways. But it's also the sort of thing that, as a human resources manager, you have to account for. The hierarchy of needs is a motivational theory in psychology comprising a five-tier model of human needs, often depicted as a pyramid. Here is Maslow's pyramid adjusted as a pyramid. These are kind of in order of the most basic need and to the kind of like the highest uh, almost spiritual level that you're dealing with over here. From physiological needs, the need just for literally physical stuff. You need food, you need air, you need water, to safety, which includes physical safety, personal safety, health, love and belonging, the idea of belonging to a group and identifying with a group, esteem, gaining self-confidence, all the way up to self-actualization, where you're working to achieve the goal of who you are trying to establish yourself as a person. I mean, that's a much different goal, as you can imagine, than I'm thirsty, get me a cup of water. So you have to understand these things from an employment standpoint. Obviously, the employee needs to be safe. The employee needs to have food and water on breaks, needs to have a restroom, whatever it is. That's obvious. But then you want to keep trying to move it up the pyramid so that the employee gets to the point where the employee is actually identifying with the goals of organization. That would be like the most ideal situation, where the employee not only has food and things for lunch and is safe on the job, but also feels like he or she belongs to a team and identifies with the company as family almost, and then gets to the point where the employee's self-esteem is tied up with the company's goals. I mean, that's really a tremendously high level where you're saying my worth as a person, I base that at least partially on how well this company does and how much I help this company. That's great. And then you get like that top level where you're literally identifying with this particular goal. So you don't necessarily have to go all the way, to that top level, but keeping in mind, as a human resources manager, keeping in mind the idea that the ideal thing is for the employees to to look at themselves as being part of a team, part of a group, identifying with trying to do as well for the company. That really is an ideal way of trying to get everybody to work together for the overall good of the company. Almost as a segue from Maslow's lead, we'll look at the quote unquote flat organization. Most organizations are hierarchical, which means you have a boss, then you have an underboss, then an underboss, then an underboss, all the way down to the assembly line worker or whatever it is who basically isn't the boss of anybody. Alternatively, you could have a flat organization. A flat organization is one where everybody is essentially equal. That might be when you're talking about a small family organization, you got 3 or 4 people running it and everybody runs it together. Ideally, what you would love is if everybody identifies so much with the organization that you don't need bosses, that everybody's able to do what they do and they want to do what they do because they're so, intent on the good of the company. Collectives, try to reach that. In Israel, the kibbutz system, where I don't know if it works as much today, but certainly originally, 60, 70, 80 years ago, people would come in and they wouldn't necessarily have bosses. They would have collectives where everybody would work as hard as they can for the benefit of the collective. Everybody would work as hard as they can for the benefit of the company or the benefit of the organization, and everybody, would work hard for that reason. That's kind of an idea of an ideal flat organization. It doesn't always work like that because if the bosses are making more money, then you need to somehow motivate the people lower down in the food chain to work hard. But that would really be an ideal situation, and if you could have this sort of flat organization. A contract worker is somebody who is not necessarily a regular employee, somebody who is hired for a specific job at a specific rate of pay. Doesn't necessarily have to be an employee. It could be a temporary worker. It could be somebody you're bringing in for a particular project. You have a case and you need to go through a zillion documents and you need to collate discovery requests in a law firm or whatever it is. So you hire a particular worker to do a particular job in a certain number of hours, and you pay a certain number per hours. Just this is just an example. If somebody completes jobs at specified deadlines, but chooses when and where he works and under what circumstances, circumstances, that person would be a contract worker. For example, if I am producing a video, let's say, let's say I'm producing a crash course video, and the company tells me, okay, Stephen, you get paid X amount of money to produce to produce the video, then then I'm a contract worker, and I don't have to do it at a particular time. I do it. I'm really what's called an independent contractor. I could do it at night. I could do it during the day. I could do it at noon. I could do it at 4 a.m. I can do it whenever I want. I don't have to go into anywhere. I can do it from my own desk. But I am not an employee of the organization. The organization doesn't have the right to my time specifically. It's just that I need to produce what I need to produce in order to satisfy my requirements under the contract or under whatever it is I'm contracted to do. Okay, let's move to interviews. And that is the idea of what can you ask on an interview? There's really two different questions. The first question is what can you ask? And number two is what should you ask? Now, what can you ask is anything that's not illegal. And illegal meaning something that is discriminatory. For example, asking what religion are you? Well, if you're a church, then then perhaps. But if you're an assembly line worker, to ask that would not be, I don't know if it's necessarily illegal to ask that in every state, but I will say that it could get you in serious trouble because if the person is not hired, they may say, well, you only hired me because I'm a Muslim, you only hired me because I'm a Christian, and they say, and the company says, no, we hired. Well, then why do you ask me what religion I am? What does that have to do with whether I can build a car? What does that have to do with whether I can defend a case? What does that have to do with whether I can fill a prescription? And you'd have to explain why you asked that question on an interview. So those are really really bad ideas. What are some good ideas to ask on interviews? Questions that deal with knowledge required to perform the duties of the position and around the key competencies of the job. If you're hiring somebody to be a lawyer, well, then you can certainly ask questions that indicate that person's experience, qualifications, and knowledge of the relevant law. For example, if you're a cab driver and they ask you what's the speed limit in a residential zone, well, you have to know those things. Otherwise, you might be expected to speed more, and that is something that's obviously relevant. Something it would be irrelevant would be what's the speed limit in a residential zone if the job that you're applying for is to be I don't know, a baseball player or something. Obviously, that wouldn't be very relevant. Okay, uh, the next issue is similar in terms of what can you force your employee or potential employee to go through when it comes to hiring practices? Can you require your employee to submit to a background check? The answer is yes. Again, not because the government normally has a right to force you to submit to a background check, but because you're applying for this job, and if you want this job, you have to have certain things that that you're willing to do. Drug testing. Drug testing is something that if the employee's policy, if it's a reasonable policy, not discriminatory, they can't just test one type of one type of group of people, one race, one religion, one gender, whatever it is. They can't do that. That would violate the Civil Rights Act. But if they want to say that everybody who works here is subject to random drug testing, they can do that. And if you say, well, I don't want to go through that drug testing because I don't like needles or whatever it is, you can do that if you like, but they don't have to hire you. They can fire you based on the fact that you're not abiding by company policies. Seniority. Seniority is a really kind of a double-edged sword when you're talking about employees. On the one hand, seniority usually means you make more money. You've been with a company 20, 30 years, usually you're making more money than if you start. Second of all, when people are fired, very often it's last in, first out. That the people who are more recent are gotten rid of, and the people with more seniority are kept on, again, just based on loyalty. On the other hand, a company might say, we want to get rid of the people that are making the most money because we need to save costs. So But there, if you have that sort of thing, you got to be very, very careful about age discrimination. But if you're not doing it for age discrimination, you could be okay. But the point is, the idea of laying people off for seniority, and this what this slide doesn't mean, laying people off because they have seniority. This slide means laying people off because they don't have seniority. People who are new to the company are usually the first people to be laid off. If the company needs to lay off people, then yeah, that's the sort of thing that is legal and in fact is common. And I guess in some sense, you could even say that it's fair because if you've been with the company a long time and you've shown a lot of loyalty to the company by working hard for it for a long time, it makes sense that you would have the first opportunity to stay in the company if the company needs to downsize. And the next part of the course is called information systems. Information systems is just a fancy way of saying the way information gets moved up and down the chain in an office. There are really two major types of information systems. There's accounting information systems and there's management information systems. Management information systems is actually an entire course that we have available as well. But today we're just kind of focus on a lot of the same things that are covered in management information systems, but again, more of on a survey level that's relevant in this course. So, information system is a software or online solution that's used for data entry, data tracking, data information requirements for the human resources management, payroll, and bookkeeping. Very often a database. QuickBooks, of course, is a famous example of something that is an information systems solution, a mechanism by which you can keep information in a centralized area. People can input data, people can take out data, people can use that information in order to generate payroll. Payroll obviously can be extremely complicated in terms of the amount of taxes that you have to withhold and the amount of insurance premiums you have to withhold, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. An HRIS, which is a human resources information system, is usually offered as a database. Some examples of the benefits of a human, and there's a lot of them over here, but let's take a look at some of these. Some of these are fairly obvious, but we'll go through them anyway. Access at your fingertips. A human resources platform like QuickBooks, which gives you all the information that everybody, on payroll and everything, it gives all the managers and all the people that are working on these things access to whatever information they need at any time. The information is kept at one central place. In the old days, everything had to be physical folders and physical files. Obviously, when you're talking about something like an online platform, a QuickBooks type platform, other types of platforms, even it doesn't have to be as complicated as QuickBooks. Human resources information system could be a Google Sheet that's shared by multiple people. An Excel spreadsheet that's shared by multiple people. There's no rule that says that the software has to be complicated. An information system could be very simple as long as and it could still be effective. It really depends on what you need. You reduce human error. If you had to add up everything on an abacus or a calculator, it would be a lot harder than using an Excel spreadsheet or software like QuickBooks to be able to do it. Implementing a human resources information system platform can prevent tax risks, financial errors, compliance issues, other human errors. The point is having good software that's really designed to make this thing simple and effective is the sort of thing that could really help the company in the long run. It also is secure with password protection. Software systems might require people to have passwords to get in, and it increases security rather than having documents, lying around, or people, using individual files and sticking it in a general Dropbox. Having an information system whereby this information is all put into a particular area that only is accessible by people who have the security clearances or that need to have access to this information certainly is a much higher level of security. It allows you to communicate more effectively. In fact, the word information is synonymous with the word communication. It strengthens collaboration, keeps communication open, especially just think of the simple example of an open Google Sheet where people's, I don't know about their salaries, but their expenses and whatever other information there is could be on this Google Sheet. It allows the people who need this information to be able to all access it quickly. In fact, if you have something like a Google Sheet, it has like a real-time chat that you can if you see somebody else is working on a particular on the spreadsheet at the same time, you can open up a chat with that person, and it really makes communication very easy, even when people are working remotely and not necessarily there to collaborate specifically. And of course, it eliminates human resources paperwork. Organizations try to avoid physical paperwork, so using information systems, using software platforms is a way to avoid having a lot of that paperwork floating around from place to place. Implementing a human resources information system is, of course, a lot easier said than done. You have to figure out a solution that's going to work for all the people that need it. So, number one, you have to configure the system for the company's processes and policies. Who runs payroll? Who runs benefits? These people all have to have access to the information. So, when designing a system as simple as a Google Sheet or as complex as a very complicated uh, software platform, you need to figure out who needs access and who needs access to which elements. Interface the data with other systems and convert the historical data into the new system. In other words, take whatever old records there were and figure out a way to input it. It could be as simple as scanning, or it could require people to physically input data to make sure the thing is up to date. You don't want information that happened more than 3 months ago to not be available in the system. That kind of defeats the purpose. You want information to go back as possible. Might not be possible to go back 100 years, but it may be possible to go back 3 years of information and input it all into the system. And of course, as time goes along, the old information will become less and less relevant. And then, of course, preparing for the system, including budgeting time, money, training, communications, developing a human resources information system. Again, this is not just simple as buying a piece of software. You are making a decision of how you as a company are going to run the communication of the data that is necessary to manage the human resources of the company. So figuring it might make sense to sit down and actually think about it and spend some time and spend some energy and spend some research to figure out what is the best type of human resources information system that we can run. Do we need a piece of fancy software? If so, which one? Could we research it? Companies may put together a committee to go out and research different types of software platforms and which ones have the best reviews. It may take a while. It may take a few months or longer even to implement a human resources information system. But of course, if it's worth it, and if you have for the next 5 years things are more efficient and things are easier, and you have all those great benefits, well then it will have been worth it. Here's an example. We have just a hypothetical over here. Alexandra's been working as a recruiting assistant since 1992. Her goal has been to organize resumes, employment applications, get letters of recommendation, process W-2s, coordinate start dates, etc., etc., etc. And the idea here is, well, okay, I mean, a lot of these things, there's still going to be somebody, even if you get a human resources information system, there's still going to be somebody who needs to coordinate it and needs to understand these things. For example, as I mentioned before, you may have software that looks through resumes and looks for certain buzzwords, but there's only a certain amount that they can do. Then you're going to need to hand it off to a human being who's going to have to look at a resume and make a determination of whether it looks right. Processing W-2s, it used to be very, very complicated. With software like QuickBooks, it becomes a lot easier, but still there has to be somebody that manages it. The point is, if you are developing a human resources information system, number one, of course, some skills are going to be less important. The idea of knowing how to do things manually, like for example in the old days when CPAs did tax returns, they would do it literally. They would take out a 1040 and they would write on it and they would do that. Having that particular skill in an age of TurboTax, not that important anymore because people don't usually need that sort of skill these days. And also you may be able to do with fewer people. Instead of 3 people running the HR department, now maybe you only need 2 or you only need 1 in some cases, but you're still going to need somebody. The point is, and if somebody's able to adapt, and if somebody is able to manage the information system, and if somebody's able to keep on top of it and make sure everything gets entered, then that is an adaptable skill, and that's a skill that people are going to need. So the fact that a company is adopting a human resources information system doesn't mean that the person who that doesn't mean that they're not going to need people managing it. They may need fewer people managing it, but they're still going to need people managing it. And in fact, they're still going to need other human resources functions, things like handling complaints and making sure that we're making reasonable accommodations. Those things are barely going to be replaced by computerization at all. But things like payroll and things like numbers actually can be replaced by information systems, but with the proviso that there is going to have to be somebody managing them as it goes along. And all this wonderful stuff, the development of human resources information systems and all those things are very often accomplished by what is sometimes referred to as a change agent, somebody who takes the impetus and creates positive change, or I guess negative change also possibly, but you hope positive change in an organization. And then that leads, of course, to success and the best ways to accomplish that. Let's look at this hypothetical. Stephen has worked as a human resource assistant for 7 years, though he's assisted with some consulting projects. His work has been dedicated to supporting his staff. Recently, he decided to go back to school to obtain a bachelor's in human resources management. Obviously, this course is just an introductory one, but you can have a bachelor's in human resources management. By the way, if you ever go on to do that, you would take courses like compensation and benefits, training and development, maybe small business administration, maybe large business administration, principles of finance, corporate finance, a lot of courses that have to deal with things having to do with running a business. Okay, so before selecting his courses, he's determined he would like to concentrate solely on strategic partnership as it's more related to his interests. Is that a good career decision? Well, the problem with that, and the idea that the lesson that we need to take from this is that you have to be able to be a good manager and to be somebody who's really involved successfully in human resources. You need to get the big picture, the 30,000-foot view, so to speak. And simply to look at one particular area, even if you know that's what you want to do specifically, you want to get as broad a degree of education as possible. To take 12 courses on one particular subspecialty, you could probably take one or two courses on that particular specialty, and the rest you learn other things. Even if you want to, for example, just be on the finance side, knowing a little bit about training and development is useful. In terms of figuring out what these things cost and what is important for a company. If you decide you want to cut costs, and the first thing you say, oh well, we've got a training budget of $25,000. Maybe we can just cut that, and that will cut costs for the company. But if you know a little bit about how important those things can be to an organization and when they can be foregone and when they should be used, that's something that will be important. Knowing all of these areas of law, areas of finance, areas of management, areas of compensation, all these things help allow the person to get the big picture. And that's really what you want out of your human resources manager, somebody to be able to see the big picture. Circle back to recruiting. Again, we already covered recruiting a little bit earlier in the video. And again, this is kind of a hypothetical over here. Again, just like we had a moment ago. Amy's applying for the position of nurse practitioner at a highly regarded cancer treatment center. She's got no criminal background, but you notice that she's got an employment gap, the dreaded employment gap on the resume. The resume usually says from this year to this year this happened, this year to this year that happened, and that's the sort of thing where you say from 2015 to 2020, the person worked for this and this company, and then from 2023 to 2025, the person worked for that company. Now, as a person who's looking at a resume, or as a recruiter, or as anybody, the first thing you're going to say, okay, what happened between 2020 and 2023? Now, there may be a perfectly legitimate answer. The person went off to raise a child, or the person, went back to school, or did whatever, and that's perfectly fine. But you do want to try to avoid these types of resume gaps. In other words, you want to try to explain them because otherwise people are going to think the worst. Otherwise, oh, it must have been in prison. But you want to explain what the gap was, especially if there's a relatively innocuous reason why that was. And there is nothing wrong with an employer looking at these things and even potentially excluding a potential hire for that reason. There's no law about saying I'm not going to hire. There's no law against saying I'm not going to hire that person because they've got an unexplained 5-year gap. That doesn't mean the 5-year gap was because the person was strung out in drugs the entire thing or in prison, but it is incumbent on the employee their potential employee to explain those things, and you may not be given the opportunity. You have a big gap in your resume. They might not call you up and say, what were you doing between 2015 and 2020? They might just not hire you, and they have every right to do that. So, while you're building a resume, you want to try to explain or indicate what happened during a gap. I went back to school. I went to raise a family. I went to tour Europe for a year. Again, none of these explanations have to be bad per se, but they should be made to avoid people making the worst, the worst possible inferences. So yes, in this case, Amy willfully disclosed the information. So she said, "I worked in this job, this and this job then," and skipped a particular employment gap. Part of a compensation structure could be bonuses. Bonuses could be based on how well the company does, could be based on performance reviews, could be based on revenue brought in by an individual. Bonuses certainly are a legitimate part of compensation and very often are in addition to base salaries. You may have a base salary of $50,000 and then get an end of year bonus in whatever amount the boss says. And bonuses, of course, are not guaranteed and may very well change from year to year. Here's a hypothetical. We got organization X is being restructured due to a merger. Organization Y, which is now in the part of the organization, believes that bonuses are crucial to employee happiness, a positive organizational culture, employee tenure, in other words, low turnover, etc. Within most departments, sales employees are the only people who get bonuses, which has resulted in dissension. In other words, the idea is that if you sell stuff, you get bonuses because you're bringing in revenue. But other people, like I think there was a plot in The Office where they did that once, where the sales people were being treated better, and then the people in accounting and quality control and whatever it is weren't being treated properly, and they got upset. So, as the Director of Employee Relations, you've been asked to propose a bonus system based on performance. What are some of the things that you would examine as relate to the position of administrative assistant? So, here are some examples. And again, there's no right or wrong answer per se here, but here are some examples. Encourage employees to show up. Monthly sales evaluated as a base measure. In other words, there has to be a certain number of sales in order for bonuses to kick in, and then beyond that, we can establish maybe not strict commissions, but bonuses based on how well the company does. And administrative staff might receive a percentage of the overall sales. In other words, what you can say is something like this. Rather than just saying the sales get the bonuses, nobody else gets the bonuses, the administrative staff gets a percentage of whatever the salespeople get. What you're doing there is you're making everybody happy, everybody gets a bonus, but what you're also doing is you are encouraging the administrative staff to work together as a team with the sales staff. And that way, if they work together rather than fighting each other, if a rising tide raises all boats. If the salespeople make more sales, then the administrative staff gets more bonuses as well. So now you're encouraging them rather than encouraging a rivalry. Now let's look at a hypothetical regarding hiring practices. Now again, we discussed the rules regarding hiring practices a little bit later on, but now again we're looking at some hypotheticals. Let's take a look at this one. Here we have a company that's highly technological government clearance and expanded operations due to a multi-million-dollar contract with the Department of Homeland Security. Each department wants to hire 2 new administrative assistants. They have to have a working knowledge of information technology systems and must maintain confidentiality. As director, your staff believes that only U.S. citizens should be selected for these open positions. Problem with that is that goes against the Civil Rights Act. We discussed before how the Civil Rights Act forbids discrimination based on certain criteria, race, religion, gender, things like that. Well, alienage or national origin, things like that, those are also prohibited criteria. Again, with certain exceptions. For example, I think immigration officers might have to be U.S. citizens. I don't know specifically offhand, but there are some things that people have to be citizens for. But certainly things like national origin are illegal bases upon which to discriminate. So You can do assessment tests, you can do reference checks, background checks to make sure the person has no criminal history, you can do credit checks, you can do all these things, but citizenship specifically, in certain cases, I mean, there are certain exceptions in law, like for example, I think state governments are allowed to check citizenship when it comes to peace officers and say that only that peace officers ought to be, ought to be U.S. citizens. But generally speaking, under the Civil Rights Act and with regard to most state and federal positions, you cannot discriminate based on what is called alienage, which means the ability to, whether you're a U.S. citizen or not. Then we've got compensation, another little hypothetical over here. Pretend you're the director of compensation at Paper Goods Unlimited. Recently, the CFO came to you to discuss reducing benefits, primarily in terms of spending Social Security and unemployment, discontinuing spending Social Security, although they probably mean pension over here. In fact, I'm going to change it. The Social Security is just one thing I should mention now that I have it over here. Social Security is a program that's run by the federal government. You lose a certain amount from your paycheck, not lose, but you pay a certain amount from your paycheck called FICA, the Federal Insurance Corporations Act, or something like that. Contributions, excuse me, Federal Insurance Contributions Act, where you pay a certain amount for Medicare and you pay a certain amount of Social Security, and then based on how many quarters you've worked and how much money you've made over the course of the years and how much money you've paid into the Social Security system over the years, and depending on when you retire, you receive a certain amount back per month. You might receive, $1,500 a month, 2,000 a month, again, depending on a whole myriad of factors. So uh, there are certain things you cannot cut. You can't cut Social Security. Well, again, that's paid by the government, but you can't. So you can't actually cut Social Security benefits. Like for example, you can't say I'm not going to collect Social Security tax. Everybody's got to pay Social Security tax. The employer's got to pay it. The employee's got to pay it, etc. Workers' compensation, like I said before, you need to have workers' compensation insurance. Unemployment insurance is required by state law. Family and medical leave, these things all are required under federal and/or state law, again, depending on the states. And of course, the CFO should figure out a way to cut other costs without cutting these things that are illegal. And we've got two more hypotheticals to look at. Organization ABC has had much difficulty in recruiting candidates due to the issues a recent organizational survey was sent out to everybody. Over 80% identified they're unhappy with the strict benefits plan. One employee stated, I love working for this company, but the benefits program is far too expensive. What do I mean by expensive? Well, health insurance, to cite one example, the employer can pay for the whole thing, the employer could pay for half, or theoretically the employer could pay for nothing. So for example, if the employer says, okay, you can have a health plan, but the health plan costs you $1,000 a month, then a private plan would cost the same amount, then you're not really getting that much of a benefit. Even if they pay half of it, if the employer pays half of your premium, which is fairly common, it's still not going to be that much of a benefit if the plan is expensive and the plan covers all sorts of things that you don't need. So another choice, another idea would be this idea of a flexible plan. Flexible benefit programs allow cafeteria benefits program, which allow the employees to select the benefits they most need from a menu of choices. We discussed the cafeteria plan a little bit earlier. Again, what that does, it says rather than having a one size fits all for the company, you allow the employees to kind of choose what they want in terms of how much they want to pay in terms of premiums and what benefits they get. Obviously, that is more expensive to administer for the company, so that's really the downside. But on the other hand, it really could help employee morale, and it could help the company in the long run. In the long run. And finally, we've got a human resources policy question. Jamie's been working as a senior accountant since 1995. He's a great employee, always shows up to work, and has never missed a day. For the 10th consecutive year, he won an award for best attendance. But last week, he missed 3 days without calling in. According to a policy, he's violated the organizational regulations because it says in the employee handbook, and companies should have employee handbooks, especially if they're relatively large companies. It's part of an organizational structure of compliance programs. One of the things, for example, that if the company gets in trouble, one of the things they look at is, okay, the employees did bad things, but did you have a program to try to prevent this? If you did, and the employees went rogue and did things bad on their own, well, maybe we can't blame you. But if you had no company handbook and you had no training and you had no mechanism by which to convince employees to behave properly, well, then it's kind of your fault that they didn't do that in the first place. So the question is, now is that it says over here that in the handbook that more than 2 days of no call, no show requires immediate termination. And recently, somebody else was fired for not showing up to work for 3 days. If that happens, you got to be very, very careful about discrimination if you don't enforce it. If you have a rule that says that somebody has to be fired after 3 days of no show, with no phone call and no excuse, and you only fire one person, not the other person might claim discrimination. If now again, discrimination is okay as long as it's not on one of these bases. But if that other person happened to have been a minority, or that other person happened to have been a religious person, or happened to have been a woman, or whatever it is that can successfully sue based on the Title Four, the Civil Rights Act, Title Seven of the Civil Rights Act, then that may lead to the company being subjected to a discrimination lawsuit. So you want to cover things and you want to enforce things as evenly, as strictly, as fairly as possible. Now, if you ask me, well, what's the remedy if you don't want to fire somebody in this sort of a situation, then don't make it so strict in the handbook. I mean, personally, when I'm writing policies, I always try to use the word may rather than must. Somebody may be fired, or somebody may be docked, or somebody may be punished, or whatever it is, rather than saying must. Because if you say the word may, you're leaving some discretion. As long as that person's an at-will employee, or whatever the contractual structures of that person's work are, you can figure it out on an individual basis. If you say must and then you don't enforce it, but you enforce it on one person, not another person, you're just kind of begging for a discrimination lawsuit. So you want to try to leave yourself as much leeway as possible. And if the handbook or the company policy says one thing, you'd better stick to it unless you can find a really good reason why you don't have to in this situation, or a really good defense in case somebody later on claims that you're being discriminatory. All right, and that's all we have for this course review. Hopefully, you've all gained from the other course resources as well as from this video. I want to say good luck to you on the final exam, and please contact us if you have any questions.